Hi group, so today we're going to talk about DNA, probably the most important part of genetics because everything we're going to talk about this year, from heredity to why you look the way you do and all the controversial issues about genetically modified food and cloning and designer babies and evolution and all this stuff, all really comes down to DNA, so it's incredibly important that we understand DNA. So here we go. So the first is, well, what does DNA stand for? So DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, which is a big fancy word. Deoxyribonucleic acid. If you need to rewind this and look at it again, but make sure that you are able to say this because in order to study DNA, I think it's important that we know how to pronounce it. So DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. And what it is, by definition, is the genetic material that carries information about an organism and is passed on from parent to offspring, which sounds like a very textbook definition, and it is. So essentially, in my own words, it's the code inside all of us, inside any living thing for the most part, that tells us why we look the way we do, why we act the way we do. Basically, it's our directions for making us who we are. And the part about being passed from parent to offspring is that once we have a child, or any animal or plant creates a new living offspring, or I guess child, a lot of our DNA is passed on to that offspring. So where do we find this DNA? So we're going to look at this little zooming animation here. So here we start at the body. So the question is, well, how do we get to the DNA? So really, we could pick anywhere in the body we want. This happens to choose in our intestines, and specifically in our small intestines. So you have learned in the past that your body is made up of cells, and all living things are made of cells. So these represent the cells in a small intestine. And if you zoom in even more, you get into the nucleus of a cell, which is kind of like the brain of the cell. And the reason it's the brain of the cell is because this is where the DNA is. And the DNA is the directions, the code for how your cells should act. So that's why it is the brain, because of the DNA. But if we zoom in any closer, we'll see all these little squiggly things, which is called the human genome, which is all these chromosomes, which we will talk about. And then in the chromosomes, you get the banding, and then in the banding, you get little pieces, which are called genes. And then you zoom in even farther, you get little pieces called chromatin loops. And if you zoom in even farther, you get chromatin scaffold, and then you keep on going even farther, and you get these nucleosomes, and you keep on going even farther, zooming in. And finally, you get to this, which is your DNA. And it says double helix because that's the shape of DNA. So I still feel like I haven't answered the question, where do you find DNA? Because you could have said in the chromosomes, in your gene, in the body, in the cells. What I'm looking for, ultimately, is in the nucleus of the cell. If I'm going to look for a perfect answer, where do you find DNA? In the nucleus of the cell. And like I said, you could get more specific and say chromosomes and stuff, but I like the answer nucleus of a cell. And you zoom in even farther, and we'll get into some topics that we're going to talk about in just a second. So I'm going to leave this picture up. So DNA usually is represented with like a picture like this, and I'm sure you've seen this picture before. And the shape of this looks like a twisted ladder, but officially the shape is called a double helix. That is the shape of DNA. Essentially taking a ladder and twisting it and making it look like this. It's called a double helix. And we're going to do a little bit of history just for a second. I think it was 1953. These two guys, very famous people, Watson and Crick are their last names. And they are the two guys who basically discovered that DNA has this shape. So you see them, and this is their model. So Watson and Crick, very famous scientists who discovered the shape of DNA. Okay, so now we know what DNA is. We know kind of what it looks like. Now we get into some big fancy words. So when you look at DNA, you have all these different colors. So the first thing to know is it doesn't really look like that. That's just a way we can kind of visualize it. DNA is made up of a bunch of parts. We are going to learn about 7 of these parts. So let's get into it. So you see that there's kind of this blue part and the red part and the orange part and the green part and the circly part and then this gray part, and then there's even a part in between here that holds these two together. So we're going to go through step by step so you know what makes up DNA, the most important molecule in genetics. So the first part we are going to talk about are the sides of the ladder. So you see on the sides there's basically 2 main parts. There's this kind of, in this picture, the green circles, and then there's the gray strands. So let's do the green circles first. So you can kind of see here that they're called sugars, and it's not the sugar that you are thinking of that you kind of you eat, but there's all different types of sugar. The type of this sugar is actually called deoxyribose, and that's why it's called deoxyribonucleic acid. So there's a sugar here, and then there's these little gray parts. They're called phosphates. So let me move this over here for you so you can actually see this a little bit and you know what I'm talking about. So the phosphates are on the sides of the ladder over here, and they're not attached to the base. So again, these are bases, which we'll talk about in just a second, but they're kind of the sides of the ladder. Whereas your sugar, or deoxyribose, looks like I spelled that wrong, hold on, sorry. Deoxyribose, they're the sides of the ladder here that actually are attached to the base. So that's the main difference, is they both make up the sides, and sometimes you'll call it a sugar phosphate backbone or sugar phosphate side of the ladder, which means that they're kind of connected and they're on the sides, but really the phosphates are the gray parts and the sugars are over here, the deoxyribose. Okay, it's important that you know that, but really the most important part of DNA are these four colors. These are incredibly important because you kind of see them go down. This is what makes your code, and everybody has a different order of these bases. So in this situation, you have like blue, orange, orange, blue, green, red, red. And there's billions and billions of these inside your body. And each of us has a different order that they're arranged in, and that's why we're all different. So that's why these are so important. So let's talk about what these four are. They're called nitrogen bases. And here's what they're called: adenine, guanine, thymine, and cytosine. And a lot of times you will see them represented as just A or G or T or C. So you're going to hear these letters all throughout genetics when we talk about DNA. A, C, G, and T. All right, so there's those four bases that we just talked about right here. These four colors, you know their names, great. But there's something more about them that's really important. So this picture here, it's kind of a stretch here, but it's a G, and this is supposed to be a cat. I think it's a cat. And the reason is you want to remember the phrase GCAT. GCAT. And if you remember GCAT, it'll be very beneficial to you. And here's why. So here's GCAT. Because this tells you what bases always go together. So guanine, or G, always pairs with cytosine. Adenine, or A, always pairs with thymine. So you'll never find an A with a G or an A with a C, or essentially almost never. G always goes with C, A with T. So the reason that GCAT's important is you remember G and C always go together, and A and T always go together. That'll help you remember who goes with what when we create our DNAs. All right, and one final thing to know about the structure of DNA. So you just learned that there is the phosphate, and then there's the sugar, and then there's the base. Those are essentially like your three main parts. And you know what? Actually, hold on a sec. We forgot one of the parts. Which did I write down? No, so I'm just going to tell you to you. Okay, so let's go back for a second. So let's go back to our picture here. So in between here, where the two bases come together, they're held together by what's called a hydrogen bond. Hydrogen bond. It's a special type of bond that is made of hydrogen, and it holds these two together. So you have to kind of use your chemistry knowledge for a little bit, then go back to hydrogen. Okay, so I'm sorry. So hydrogen bond holds these two together, holds these two together, holds these two together. Okay, so our seven major parts are your sugar, your phosphate, your adenine, your thymine, your guanine, your cytosine, and your hydrogen base. Seven major parts. Okay, sorry, let's go back to that picture. So when you have a phosphate, a sugar, and a base, basically one chunk, if you will, of DNA, one little section that includes all three parts, that is called a nucleotide. So basically DNA is made up of billions and billions of nucleotides. And the reason that these are actually a little bit different is because the guanine, cytosine, adenine, and thymine are actually, some of them are a little different than each other. One's a double molecule, one's a single. You don't need to know the purine and pyrimidine. But that's why there's two pictures. You do need to know that the three of them together is called a nucleotide. All right, so if this is a little scary to you, overwhelming, I'm sorry, but this is genetics. There's a lot of big fancy words and what makes what, and it may not seem like it matters and who cares and why we need to learn these letters, but ultimately we have to know what makes DNA, because then we can understand DNA and ultimately understand what's going on in genetics. It's extremely important. All right. As always, if you don't understand something, rewind the video, ask me any questions, ask your neighbor any questions, and use any of the other resources I provided with you. Brain Pop has a good one. There's a good YouTube video, the Amoeba Sisters. They do a really good one. And yeah, so that was DNA in a nutshell. All right. See you later.